"You shouldn't have come back," the young woman said the instant she opened the front door, her voice sharp enough to stop the morning breeze, and for a long second neither of them moved. The quiet neighborhood seemed to hold its breath as Grace Johnson stood on the front porch with her hands folded gently in front of her, wearing a neatly pressed navy coat that had seen better years and carrying a small brown envelope that looked far too ordinary for the weight it seemed to hold. Across the street, sprinklers hissed across perfectly trimmed lawns while a delivery truck rolled slowly past, without anyone inside realizing they were passing the beginning of a story that had waited 10 long years to reach this doorstep. Emily Carter stared at the older woman with disbelief, then with irritation, and finally with something she refused to call fear. She tightened her grip on the polished brass doorknob, as if the expensive house behind her could somehow protect her from the past standing only a few feet away. "I told you never to come here," Emily said, lowering her voice after noticing a neighbor glance toward the driveway. Grace didn't answer immediately. Instead, her eyes wandered past Emily's shoulder into the bright entryway where sunlight spilled across white oak floors and framed family photographs lined the walls. She noticed the crystal chandelier hanging exactly where she had once imagined a warm dining room would be, the fresh flowers arranged carefully on the hallway table, and the faint smell of cinnamon drifting from somewhere inside. It was a beautiful home, the kind of place people admired from passing cars, but Grace wasn't looking at its beauty. She was looking at a dream she recognized long before anyone else ever saw it standing here. Emily crossed her arms. "Whatever you came for, you need to leave." Grace finally lifted her eyes and met her daughter's gaze. There was no anger in them, no accusation, only a calmness that somehow felt heavier than either one. The silence between them stretched so long that even the birds nesting in the maple tree above seemed louder than before. Grace slowly glanced toward the polished mailbox near the front walk, where elegant black letters spelled out the family name Carter. Her expression never changed, but something behind her eyes flickered like an old memory catching light after years in darkness. She drew a slow breath filled with crisp autumn air before speaking for the first time. "I didn't come to argue," she said softly. "I only wanted to see the house." Emily let out a nervous laugh that sounded forced even to herself. "You saw it. Now go." Grace nodded almost politely, yet she made no move to leave. Instead, her fingers rested lightly on the worn envelope she carried as though reminding herself why she had driven nearly 400 miles to stand exactly where she was standing. The wind lifted a few silver strands of hair across her face, while fallen leaves rolled gently across the driveway, like tiny whispers from another season. 10 years had changed almost everything about Grace Johnson except the quiet dignity that hardship had never managed to take from her. She looked once more at the front door, then at the windows reflecting the clear blue sky, and finally back at the daughter who no longer recognized the woman who had once sacrificed everything so she could dream beyond poverty. Emily felt an uneasiness she couldn't explain settle deep inside her chest, because for the first time since opening the door, she realized Grace wasn't here to ask for anything at all. Grace remained perfectly still while Emily waited for another argument that never came. Instead, the older woman quietly lowered her eyes, and in that single silent moment the years folded backward like pages carried by the wind. 10 years earlier, Grace Johnson had lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of Charlotte, North Carolina, where every morning began before sunrise. She worked as a home health aide, caring for elderly patients who often had no family left to visit them. Her days were measured by medicine schedules, warm meals, gentle conversations, and long drives across the city. The work was exhausting, but Grace carried herself with quiet pride because every paycheck meant another chance to give her daughter a better future than she had ever known. Emily had grown up watching her mother leave before dawn and return after dark with sore feet, tired eyes, and the same reassuring smile that somehow made their little apartment feel larger than it was. Grace never complained about working weekends. She never complained about driving an old sedan with more than 200,000 miles on the odometer. Whenever Emily apologized for not having the things her classmates had, Grace would simply place a hand on her shoulder and say that a person was never measured by what they owned, only by the kindness they carried into the world. Emily nodded whenever she heard those words, But as she grew older, she became increasingly fascinated by another world, one filled with elegant neighborhoods, luxury cars, polished kitchens, and houses with wraparound porches that seemed impossible to reach from where they stood. Sometimes mother and daughter would drive through those neighborhoods on Sunday afternoons after church. Grace would smile and admire the flower gardens while Emily stared silently through the passenger window, imagining what it would feel like to belong there. One afternoon, they stopped in front of a beautiful colonial-style home with white columns and a wide front porch. Emily whispered that one day she would buy a house just like that for both of them. Grace laughed softly, squeezed her daughter's hand, and told her she believed every dream became possible when it was built with honesty and patience. Those words settled into the quiet air, but they did not settle into Emily's heart the way Grace had hoped. After college, Emily struggled to find the career she had imagined. Bills arrived faster than opportunities, and social media filled her days with photographs of friends buying homes, celebrating promotions, and living lives that seemed to move ahead while hers remained painfully still. Grace noticed the growing frustration behind her daughter's smile, yet she never judged her. One rainy evening, Emily arrived carrying paperwork and wearing an expression that mixed excitement with worry. She explained that a mortgage lender needed additional documents because her application had encountered unexpected complications. She asked if she could temporarily use a few of Grace's personal records to help verify family information until everything was finalized. Grace did not hesitate. She trusted her daughter the same way she trusted the sunrise to arrive every morning. Without reading every page, she opened the small fireproof box where she kept every important document she owned, carefully lifted out the envelope containing her identification, financial records, and signature forms, and placed it into Emily's waiting hands with a warm smile. As Emily hugged her tightly before leaving, Grace stood in the apartment doorway watching her drive away beneath the falling rain, never imagining that the trust she had freely given would quietly reshape both of their lives before another season had passed. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Emily called her mother every few days, speaking with the same cheerful voice Grace had trusted since childhood. She thanked her repeatedly for lending the paperwork and explained that the lender was asking endless questions before approving the mortgage. Grace believed every word because trust had never required proof inside her heart. Then the phone calls became less frequent. Text messages replaced conversations. Excuses replaced visits. Emily always sounded busy, always promised she would stop by next weekend, and always found another reason to postpone. Grace convinced herself that this was simply what adulthood looked like. Young people built careers, chased promotions, and sometimes forgot to slow down. She refused to think anything worse. Nearly 3 months later, everything changed on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Grace had just returned home after spending 12 hours caring for an elderly veteran recovering from heart surgery. Her shoulders ached, and the smell of antiseptic still lingered on her uniform as she opened her apartment mailbox, expecting nothing more than utility bills. Instead, she found a thick certified envelope from a financial institution she had never done business with. Assuming it was a mistake, she carried it upstairs without concern. She poured herself a cup of chamomile tea, settled into the small kitchen chair beside the window, and carefully opened the envelope. The warm cup slipped slightly in her trembling hands as her eyes moved across the first page. According to the documents, she had recently signed a mortgage agreement worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Monthly payments had already become overdue. Interest charges were accumulating. Additional notices warned that failure to resolve the account could seriously damage her financial standing. Grace blinked several times, convinced she was reading someone else's paperwork. She checked the address. It was hers. She checked the name. It was hers. Then she reached the final page where a signature rested above the printed line, bearing her full legal name. At first glance, it looked almost perfect. Almost. But she knew every curve of her own handwriting after decades of signing medical forms and patient records. Someone had copied it carefully, yet not perfectly. A cold silence settled over the apartment. Outside, children laughed while riding bicycles through the parking lot, and somewhere a lawn mower hummed beneath the afternoon sun. But inside Grace's tiny kitchen, every familiar sound seemed impossibly far away. She immediately called Emily. The call rang once before reaching voicemail. She tried again. No answer. She left a calm message asking her daughter to call as soon as possible because there appeared to be an important misunderstanding. Hours passed. Evening arrived. The sky faded from bright blue into deep violet, while the untouched cup of tea slowly turned cold beside the unopened mail. Finally, just before 10 o'clock, Emily called back. Her voice sounded hurried and strangely distant. Before Grace could explain everything, Emily interrupted, insisting there had probably been a clerical error that the bank would correct in a few days. She encouraged her mother not to worry and promised she would handle everything personally. Then the line disconnected. Grace wanted to believe her. She truly did. But the next morning another envelope arrived, followed by another the week after that. Collection notices became increasingly urgent, and every conversation with the lender confirmed the same impossible truth. A house had been purchased using Grace Johnson's identity, and according to every official record, she alone was legally responsible for every dollar owed. Standing beside her apartment window as rain tapped softly against the glass, Grace stared into the gray morning and whispered a question no mother ever imagines asking herself. When had trust quietly become the most expensive thing she had ever given away? The weeks that followed slowly erased every comforting illusion Grace had tried to preserve. Each phone call with the lender revealed another piece of a puzzle she never agreed to assemble. The mortgage application had been approved. The closing documents had been processed. Utility accounts had been activated. Property taxes had been filed. Every signature pointed back to her name, and every legal obligation rested squarely on her shoulders. She could have hired an attorney immediately. Friends from church quietly encouraged her to report everything to the police. One neighbor even offered to connect her with a legal aid organization. Grace listened to every suggestion with gratitude, yet every time she imagined the investigation, she saw only one face. Emily, her little girl who used to race into her arms after elementary school, who used to leave handwritten birthday cards on the kitchen table, who once promised they would grow old together in a beautiful home. Grace could not bring herself to become the reason her own daughter faced criminal charges. Instead, she made a decision that almost everyone around her believed was impossible to understand. She would carry the burden herself while praying that one day Emily would find the courage to tell the truth. The decision came with a cost that no one else could see. Grace accepted additional shifts caring for patients during the day. After sunset, she cleaned office buildings until nearly midnight, pushing a mop through silent hallways where only fluorescent lights and humming air conditioners kept her company. On weekends, she stocked shelves at a neighborhood grocery store before returning to another overnight caregiving assignment. Her old sedan accumulated thousands of additional miles each year, and the small notebook she carried in her purse slowly filled with carefully written budgets. Every gallon of gasoline mattered. Every grocery receipt mattered. Every dollar went toward the mortgage payment attached to a house she had never entered. Seasons quietly turned. Summers faded into crisp autumn mornings. Holiday lights appeared and disappeared along streets where families gathered while Grace continued working. She never missed a payment after that first frightening notice. She skipped vacations she had never planned to take anyway. She repaired old shoes instead of replacing them. She learned how to stretch every paycheck until there was nothing left to stretch. Sometimes, during the few quiet minutes before dawn, she would sit inside her car outside another patient's home and watch the sky brighten from charcoal gray into soft shades of gold. Those brief moments became her only luxury. She wondered where Emily was living, whether she was healthy, whether she had found happiness inside the home purchased at such a terrible price. She never stopped loving her daughter, but love slowly changed its shape. It became quieter, stronger, and far less dependent on being returned. Years passed without birthdays celebrated together or holiday dinners shared across the same table. Christmas cards stopped arriving. Phone numbers changed. Messages went unanswered. Eventually, even the silence became familiar. Grace no longer counted the years by calendars, but by mortgage statements that arrived faithfully every month. One payment after another, the balance slowly began to shrink. The numbers that once seemed impossible gradually became manageable. Hope did not return all at once. It arrived one receipt at a time, one sacrifice at a time, one sunrise after another. And although Grace never spoke the words aloud, she quietly made herself a promise every time she mailed another payment. Someday, when the final dollar had been paid, She would stand in front of that house not to reclaim what had been taken, but to finally discover whether truth had been waiting behind its front door all along. On an unusually cool October morning, nearly 10 years after the first payment had stolen her sleep, Grace walked into the downtown branch of the bank carrying the same worn leather folder she had protected through countless moves, endless work shifts, and years of quiet perseverance. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood as sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming the marble floor beneath her steady steps. She greeted the receptionist with the same gentle smile she offered everyone, then took a seat without looking at the clock. She had learned long ago that the most important moments in life could not be rushed. A few minutes later, a senior loan officer invited her into a private office overlooking the city skyline. Grace carefully unfolded every receipt she had saved, each one neatly organized by year. The officer reviewed the account, compared the payment history, and finally looked back at her with an expression that slowly softened into quiet respect. He turned his computer monitor toward her and pointed to a single line near the bottom of the statement. The outstanding balance now reads $0. For a moment, Grace simply stared at the screen. She did not cheer. She did not cry. She quietly closed her eyes and released a slow breath she had been holding for almost a decade. The weight she had carried every morning before sunrise and every night after returning home had finally disappeared. The loan officer congratulated her, explaining that the mortgage obligation had been fully satisfied and that the account would officially be closed. He handed her several certified documents inside a crisp envelope and wished her peace in whatever came next. Grace thanked him sincerely, placed the envelope inside her old leather folder, and stepped back into the bright autumn afternoon. Leaves drifted gently across the sidewalk while a cool breeze carried the scent of pine and distant fireplaces preparing for winter. She stood beside her aging sedan for several quiet seconds before opening the driver's door. There was only one place she intended to go. For 100 miles later, as the afternoon sun stretched long golden shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood, Grace slowly turned onto the familiar street she had memorized years earlier from public property records. Everything looked peaceful. Children laughed in nearby yards. A golden retriever chased a tennis ball across fresh green grass. Wind chimes sang softly from neighboring porches. The house itself looked even more beautiful than she had imagined, with white columns glowing beneath the warm light and colorful flower beds carefully arranged along the walkway. Grace parked across the street and remained inside the car, her hands resting gently on the steering wheel. She was not nervous about seeing the house. She was wondering whether the person inside still remembered the woman who had believed in her without asking for anything in return. After several minutes, she stepped out, straightened her navy coat, picked up the familiar brown envelope, and slowly walked toward the front porch. Every footstep felt surprisingly light. There was no anger left to carry. No bitterness remained after 10 years of sacrifice. Only truth. She climbed the final step, reached toward the polished brass doorbell, and pressed it once. Inside the house, footsteps approached. The lock clicked. The door opened. Emily stood frozen on the other side, and the color slowly faded from her face the instant she recognized the woman standing quietly beneath the autumn sunlight. Neither woman spoke after the door opened. The silence settled between them with a weight that words could not have carried. Emily remained in the doorway, one hand still resting on the edge of the door, as if she had forgotten why she had opened it in the first place. Grace simply looked past her for a moment. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting warm patterns across the hardwood floor. Fresh flowers rested on a table near the entrance. Family photographs lined the hallway, smiling faces frozen in happier moments. Grace noticed every detail without envy. She had imagined this house thousands of times during lonely nights, yet standing inside its shadow felt strangely peaceful instead of painful. Emily finally found her voice. "Why are you here?" she asked, but the confidence she had shown only moments earlier had quietly disappeared. Grace lowered her eyes to the brown envelope in her hands before lifting them again. "I told you," she answered softly. "I wanted to see the house." Emily shook her head. "After everything that happened, you drive all this way just to look at it?" Grace nodded gently. Some promises deserve to be seen through to the end. Emily frowned, unable to understand the meaning behind those words. A cool breeze slipped through the open doorway, carrying the scent of fallen leaves across the polished entryway. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while riding bicycles along the quiet street. The ordinary sounds made the silence inside the house feel even deeper. Grace slowly stepped back from the threshold without asking to come inside. She rested one hand lightly against the porch railing, its white paint warmed by the afternoon sun. Her fingers traced the smooth wood for only a second before she smiled almost to herself. "This railing is solid," she whispered. "Whoever built it did good work." Emily stared in confusion. She had expected accusations, demands, perhaps years of buried anger finally erupting. Instead, she found herself facing a woman who admired the craftsmanship of a porch she had every reason to resent. "Do you hate me?" Emily asked quietly, surprising herself with the question. Grace looked at her daughter for a long moment before answering. "No." The single word hung gently in the autumn air. Being hurt and hating someone are not the same thing. Emily lowered her eyes. She could no longer meet the calm gaze standing in front of her. Grace glanced once more toward the front yard where a young maple tree stretched its branches toward the clear blue sky. The trunk was thick now, its leaves glowing shades of gold and crimson. She smiled faintly. "That tree was only a sapling when this house was built," she said. "It grew a little every year." Emily turned to look at the tree as well. She had never thought much about it. She barely remembered planting it. Grace continued speaking in the same gentle tone. "Some things grow quietly. Trees. Trust. Regret." Another long silence followed. Emily felt her throat tighten as memories she had spent years burying slowly surfaced beneath Grace's quiet words. She realized that her mother had not come carrying anger across 400 miles. She had carried something much heavier. Patience. Grace carefully adjusted the envelope beneath her arm and looked back at the front door one final time. "It really is a beautiful home," she said with complete sincerity. "I'm glad someone took care of it." Emily's chest grew heavier with every calm sentence because she suddenly understood that kindness could sometimes be far more difficult to stand before than anger. And for the first time in 10 years, she found herself afraid not of losing the house, but of hearing whatever Grace had come to say next. Grace looked at Emily for another quiet moment before slowly opening the worn brown envelope she had carried across 400 miles. The paper inside was crisp and carefully protected despite the years. She did not rush. She unfolded each document with the same patience that had carried her through 10 long years of early mornings and late nights. Emily watched every movement without speaking. The sound of the pages sliding against one another seemed unusually loud in the still afternoon air. Grace handed the first document toward her daughter. "You should read this," she said gently. Emily hesitated before accepting it. Across the top appeared the letterhead of the county court, followed by several pages of legal findings. Her eyes moved quickly from one paragraph to the next until they stopped on a sentence that drained every trace of confidence from her expression. The investigation had concluded that the original mortgage application had been approved using fraudulent identification and unauthorized signatures. Because the transaction had been based upon identity fraud, the original transfer of ownership had been declared legally invalid. Emily looked up, unable to breathe normally. Grace quietly offered the second document. It contained years of payment records, every monthly installment carefully documented, every receipt bearing Grace Johnson's name. There was not a single missed payment after the first notice. 10 years of sacrifice lay before Emily in neat rows of dates and amounts. Grace had never spoken about those years because she had never wanted pity. She had simply continued paying what the world believed she owed while quietly gathering the truth one document at a time. Emily's hands began to tremble. You knew?" she whispered. Grace nodded softly. "I learned the truth much sooner than you probably imagined." Emily lowered her eyes again. "Why did you not come after me?" Grace glanced toward the maple tree swaying gently in the front yard. "Because I hoped one day you would come back on your own." Emily felt tears gathering despite every effort to stop them. Grace removed one final envelope and placed it carefully on the porch railing between them. "Last month, the court finished reviewing everything," she explained. "The title has been restored to its lawful owner." Emily slowly opened the envelope. Inside rested an official certified deed carrying Grace Johnson's name. Beside it lay another letter confirming that every mortgage payment had already been satisfied in full. The house that Emily had believed represented the life she had built was no longer legally hers. It had never truly been hers. She looked around at the walls she had painted, the photographs she had framed, the front porch where birthday decorations had once hung, and suddenly realized that every beautiful memory inside this home had been standing upon a foundation built from someone else's trust. Her knees felt weak. "I have nothing left," she whispered. Grace stepped closer, not with triumph, but with quiet compassion. "No," she answered. "You still have something very valuable." Emily slowly lifted her eyes. Grace's expression remained calm. "You still have the chance to become the person you wanted everyone to believe you already were." For the first time since opening the door, Emily could not hide from the truth reflected in her mother's peaceful eyes, because the woman standing before her had not defeated her through anger, wealth, or revenge. She had endured with honesty until the truth had finally found its own voice. Emily could no longer hold back the tears she had spent years refusing to face. They slipped quietly down her cheeks as she lowered the deed onto the porch railing with trembling hands. The afternoon sunlight that had once made the house appear perfect now seemed to expose every hidden corner of her conscience. She looked toward her mother, expecting anger, disappointment, perhaps even satisfaction. Instead, she found only compassion. That realization hurt more than any accusation ever could. "I am so sorry," Emily whispered, her voice barely louder than the rustling leaves overhead. "I told myself I was borrowing time. I kept believing I would fix everything before you ever found out. Then every year it became harder to tell the truth." Grace listened without interrupting. She had imagined this conversation many times during lonely drives home after midnight shifts, but reality was quieter than anything she had rehearsed in her mind. Emily slowly sank onto the front step, covering her face with both hands. "I was ashamed," she admitted. "I wanted people to believe I had succeeded. Every promotion, every dinner party, every compliment about this house only made the lie bigger. I stopped calling because every conversation reminded me of what I had done to you." Grace gently sat beside her on the porch, leaving enough space for Emily to breathe without feeling cornered. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. The wind carried the scent of pine through the neighborhood, while the maple tree scattered a few golden leaves across the front walk. Grace reached down and picked up one of them, turning it slowly between her fingers. "Do you remember our Sunday drives?" she asked quietly. Emily nodded through her tears. "You always admired the flowers," she answered. Grace smiled softly. "And you always admired the houses." Another silence settled over them, but this one no longer felt cold. It felt honest. Emily finally looked at her mother. "Are you going to make me leave?" Grace gazed at the home one more time before answering. "The court gave me that choice." Emily lowered her head again, accepting whatever came next. Grace folded the leaf carefully and placed it inside the brown envelope before speaking. "I have spent 10 years paying for this house. During those same 10 years I learned something important. A house can protect people from rain, but it cannot protect them from regret. Only truth can do that." Emily closed her eyes as those words settled into her heart. Grace continued gently. "I did not come here because I wanted revenge. If revenge had been my goal, I would have chosen it years ago. I came because I wanted both of us to stop living inside the same lie." Emily reached for her mother's hand with hesitation, uncertain whether she had earned the right to do so. Grace did not pull away. Their hands rested together for the first time in nearly a decade, weathered fingers holding younger ones that had finally stopped pretending to be stronger than they were. Grace smiled warmly. "I have already spoken with my attorney," she said. "The house will be sold. After the legal expenses are paid, the remaining equity belongs to me. But I have decided that part of those funds will help you begin again." Emily looked up in disbelief. "After everything I did?" Grace nodded. "Yes, not because what happened was acceptable, but because I refused to let the worst decision of your life become the final chapter of your life. This time you will build something that truly belongs to you, using your own name, your own work, and your own honesty. That will be worth far more than this house ever was." Emily broke into quiet tears once more, but for the first time in many years they were not tears of fear. They were the beginning of accountability, forgiveness, and a future that no longer needed to hide behind someone else's identity. 6 months later, the house stood empty, its rooms filled only with soft echoes and afternoon light drifting across bare hardwood floors. The family photographs had been packed away. The furniture had found new homes. Fresh paint covered the walls where a decade of memories had quietly settled. Grace walked through each room one final time before handing the keys to the real estate agent. She paused in the doorway of what had once been the living room and smiled gently. The house had never truly been the victory. It had simply been the place where the truth finally caught up with the past. After the sale was completed, Grace kept only what she needed. She purchased a small cottage on the edge of a peaceful North Carolina town where tall oak trees shaded the front yard and birds greeted each morning with familiar songs. The porch was modest, the garden was simple, and the mortgage was fully paid before she ever moved in. On her first evening there, she planted a young maple tree near the front walk, carefully pressing the soil around its roots with weathered hands that had spent a lifetime caring for other people. She whispered that this tree would never have to grow in the shadow of a lie. Emily kept the promise she had made on the porch that autumn afternoon. She accepted responsibility for the choices she had made and began rebuilding her life with honesty instead of appearances. She found steady work, rented a small apartment she could truly afford, and slowly learned that peace arrived much more easily when nothing had to be hidden. Every Sunday, she drove to visit Grace. Sometimes they shared coffee on the porch. Sometimes they worked quietly in the garden. Sometimes they said very little at all. Their relationship did not heal overnight because real trust rarely returns that quickly, but with every honest conversation, another small piece found its way home. One spring afternoon, Emily carried a wooden mailbox post into the front yard and asked if she could install it herself. Grace watched with quiet pride as her daughter measured carefully, dug patiently, and secured every bolt without asking anyone else to finish the job for her. When it was complete, Emily gently attached a simple black mailbox bearing one name in clean white letters. Johnson. She stepped back and looked toward her mother with eyes no longer searching for approval, but simply hoping she had done good work. Grace nodded with a warm smile. "It looks perfect," she said. Emily smiled for the first time without pretending to be someone she was not. As the evening sun settled behind the trees, golden light spilled across the porch where the two women sat side by side, watching the young maple sway gently in the breeze. No mansion stood before them. No expensive neighborhood surrounded them. Yet the quiet little cottage felt warmer than any grand house ever could because everything inside it had been built with truth. Grace rested her hands in her lap and closed her eyes for a brief moment, listening to the wind move softly through the leaves. After all those years, she finally understood that forgiveness had never erased what happened. It had simply refused to let the worst moment of her life become the last one. The camera of memory would forever leave them there, beneath the evening sky, where a mother regained her name, a daughter found her character, and a small house became a home because the strongest foundation any family can ever build is not wealth, nor pride, but honesty patiently restored one quiet day at a time.